Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this Facebook Live conversation on crises in the post-Soviet region. I'm Matt Rojansky, director of the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center, and I'm very pleased today to be able to hold this conversation with Dr. Igor Zabelyev, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. As you no doubt know, if you're tuning into this conversation, the last half year, in addition to the worldwide COVID-19 crisis, has witnessed across the former Soviet space and in Russia's neighboring regions from Europe to Central Asia, a number of significant political and security crises in addition to the public health crisis, whether that's the popular uprising following the elections in Belarus, leadership changes and violence in Kyrgyzstan, and of course, quite bloody, quite significant upsurge in the fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the 3-decade-long conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, which for the moment seems to be simmering, but may not in fact be over. So the conversation today is going to try to look at these conflicts from Russia's perspective. What are Russia's interests? What's Russia's approach? Why has Russia been in varying degrees more and less engaged? And I truly can't think of anyone more insightful and I think up to the minute in terms of analysis than Igor Zabelyev to talk to us about that. In fact, Igor has a brand new Kennan Cable, which is our longer format, but still general audience publication, which you can find on the Kennan Institute website. There'll be a link to it in the Facebook chat my colleagues are posting now. So take a look at that publication. I may in fact read out some quotes from it to help prompt our conversation along. I also want to encourage you while I'm at it to join in with your own questions via Facebook. You can also email them to kennan@wilsoncenter.org. And please include your name and affiliation when you are sending in questions. Finally, for more content that's already been recorded, you can listen to anytime. Check out our podcasts, Kennan X and the Russia File, which are available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, everywhere else, as well as a link from our website. So without further ado, let me introduce Igor. He is a global fellow at the Kennan Institute. This is in fact his third fellowship with Kennan. He was a George F. Kennan Fellow in 2019 and 20 and a short-term scholar in 1994. His current research is in the fields of national identity, discourse, nationalism, Russia's foreign policy towards neighboring states, and Russian-American relations. From 2017 to 2019, he was a professor of national security studies at the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies, and in 2017, he taught at Johns Hopkins SAIS. He's also been a visiting professor at the Universities of Washington, University of California, Berkeley, and Macalester College, and from 2008 to 2016 was director of the Russia office of the MacArthur Foundation. He has published 5 books, and his PhD in political science is from the Institute of International Relations and World Economy in Moscow. So Igor, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for having me.
Well, this conversation can go in a number of different directions, but as I promised, while we have questions coming in from the audience and we can go up to an hour, we may go a little bit less than that, I want to start with a few of my own, and I want to begin kind of with the conceptual framing, right? So in your piece, Russia and the Changing Post-Soviet Space, which I commend to everybody, you talk almost implicitly about the Russian goal of being a kind of guarantor and arbiter, but always somehow being involved in the post-Soviet space. If you start from the premise that, there are 15 independent countries in the space that used to be the former Soviet Union, rather than the premise of kind of there's Russia and Russia's neighborhood, which is obviously two very different worldviews, the question naturally arises, why? Why does the Kremlin have to play this special role? Why does it have to be a regional guarantor? Why does it have to have its fingers in everything? And let me put an even finer point on that before I let you respond, which is it even good for Russia to always have that expectation and that obligation?
Well, when we talk about Russia, it's very often about status and identity. Status is similar to prestige. People and states want to feel good about themselves, and they seek status, which may be described as recognized identity. And Russian identity is great power and successor of the former Soviet Union. So, but if you just repeat it 1,000 times a day, nobody will believe you unless you act as a great power and confirm this state, this identity, and it is recognized as your status. So it's about status, recognized identity, and identity itself. Russia, unlike other successor states of the former Soviet Union, feels more connection to the Soviet Union. The Russian Socialist Federative Republic, as a constituent part of the Soviet Union, was not actually separated from the old Union center. It doesn't have a separate capital. Moscow played the role as both Russian capital and Soviet capital. It didn't have major institutions like the Communist Party of the Russian Republic was created shortly before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet center merged with Russia. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, that was a deep identity crisis. And most Russians had very difficult time to recognize other successor states as true states, as independent states. But now, of course, we live in a different world, and 30 years have passed after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And a younger generation of Russians feels and thinks very differently. And they raise these questions: why should we do that? We have a lot of problems at home. So the Kremlin plays this delicate, tries to find this delicate balance between being a great power and success of the former Soviet on the one hand, but to play as a nation state, as a true nation state, which is not the former Soviet Union on the other hand. So, and the recent crisis in many parts of the former Soviet Union close to Russia just showed how difficult this game is for the Kremlin and for the Russian public.
Let's drill down, if we can, a little bit on this question of national interest. It seems ironic to me that, especially in the Putin years, post-Soviet Russia has been described, interestingly, not, well, look, I guess it's fair to say it's been described in a great many ways. Some people talk about an obsession with recreating Russian Empire, recreating the Soviet Union, but then on the other hand, Putin's foreign policy, often, for example, citing Primakov, the ideas of multipolarity, very much of a realist worldview, seems to be ultimately premised on national interest. And where I see these two concepts coming into collision most often very much is the former Soviet space. When Russians ask the question, what is our national interest in this region? It seems to me that to say, well, we've always been there and it's always been important, isn't really a sufficient answer as to why that's in Russia's national interest. Is there a compelling argument that convinces Russians today that isn't just about, well, we used to be there, this used to be Soviet, or it used to be the Russian Empire?
Well, of course, there are new reasons why Russia should play a special role on the territory of the former Soviet Union. At least these reasons are propagated by the Kremlin. Many Russians are convinced, while many Russians do not believe that. And this is about the role of the West. And from the Kremlin perspective, if we do not play a special role in the post-Soviet space, the West will fill the vacuum. And the West, not only as a power that brings new technology, new norms, new values, but also power bringing NATO closer to Russian borders, bringing military presence, first on rotational basis and then on permanent basis, like it's going on in Poland right now. And in the Kremlin world, if not we, then the West, and that will be the end of Russia, because the West is not only the military power, but power that would like to change Russian identity to something very different, to make Russians like the Westerners, or at least the Kremlin says that. Once again, not all the Russians are convinced that this is true, but many Russians believe that.
So that's interesting, because it anticipates one possible counterexample, which would be if you look, for example, at the South Caucasus, especially within the last month, or if you look at Central Asia over the last 5 to 10 years, you do see the encroachment of other powers in a zero-sum way, right? I mean, if Turkey becomes Azerbaijan's main patron, then it can no longer be Moscow. If China becomes the main trading partner of, pick your Central Asian republic, or maybe of all 5 of them, then it can no longer be Moscow. And yet these encroachments don't seem to raise anything like the same concern that you just described, of a vacuum allowing NATO, allowing America to come in. What is the issue? Is it this deep, you touched on, I think it's a fascinating question, this impression that somehow what the West wants to do is change Russia's identity, and maybe Chinese don't care as much, or Turks don't care as much about that? I mean, why is it seen differently?
Well, indeed, if you look at Central Asia or South Caucasus, you see that Turkey is in, France and the United States are out. If you look in Central Asia, yes, China is in. The United States practically is absent. The EU tries to do something, but actually very little. The main competitor is China. And speaking in economic terms, China is the leading power in Central Asia, while Russia remains an important player in the area of security. But why Russia is concerned mostly about the West? Because yes, the West wants and can change Russian identity. It has a very powerful and promising ally within Russia. And this is constituency that wants political change in Russia, that wants to see political scene being more competitive, that wants respect for human rights. And from the Kremlin perspective, the West allies with these constituencies, and that's it is such a dangerous power, unlike Turkey or China, who do not care what is going on within Russia, who do not care about the nature of the political regime in Moscow or about human rights. So these are absolutely different competitors for Russia, China and Turkey on one hand and the West on the other.
China poses a very important example, I think, in the different measures of power and influence. When I talk to Chinese counterparts, whether they're experts or even government officials, the line is very consistent. I'm always asking about Chinese and Russian influence in Central Asia, and I'm always getting the answer from Chinese, well, we respect that Russia is the traditional political and security power in that region. And yet everybody knows, as you said, that China's economy is dominant. That if you want a trading partner, it's China. Was there ever a pathway for Russia that looked different? And what I'm thinking about in particular is soft power, right? So Russia does produce some things that people want, mainly natural resources, but it also produces kind of cultural outputs that are very popular. at least in the Russian-speaking world. And of course, for example, Russian education and the Russian language is a kind of a lingua franca across the entire region. Was there ever a pathway? Was there ever a time when the Kremlin said, the way that we can win friends and influence in our neighborhood is soft power and not hard power?
Soft power has been often confused with propaganda in Russia. At the same time, there have been positive changes in the leadership of Россотрудничество. It's taking a different approach now under the leadership of Yevgeny Primakov, the grandson of Yevgeny Primakov. There is a new approach. But the main thing is that soft power is about attractiveness of the country. And very often, a country is attractive without much governmental effort. It is attractive because its economy, political system, lifestyle, culture are popular and appeal to foreign audiences. And Russia remains attractive in the post-Soviet space, not because of, but probably in spite of the governmental efforts. Russia is number 4 in the world in terms of number of migrants coming to Russia to work after the United States, Germany, and Saudi Arabia. So millions of people see Russia as a place where employment opportunities are. Also, educational opportunities, even medical care. While Russians all the time complain with good reason about their medical care, but many people from Central Asia prefer to go to Russia to get treatment. And so on and so forth. The role of the Russian language. There were many predictions in the early 90s that it will fade away, but I traveled recently throughout Central Asia and South Caucasus, and Russian remains the language of international communication throughout those regions. So Russia has a lot of soft power instruments, but it hasn't learned how to use them properly.
I'm going to ask you an unfair question, which is, on a spectrum, can you place for me the countries and areas of greatest, most intense interest for Russians in the post-Soviet space and those of the least interest? And it's an unfair question, but are you willing to try?
Of course, Ukraine and Belarus, they are the most important countries for Russians. There is no question about that.
And then, so presumably you would put what, the Caucasus, Central Asia, even, for example, the Baltic region, which is now in the EU and NATO, where would you put them on the spectrum?
It's a difficult question because there are many different perspectives in Russia on any single issue. And if you ask 1,000 people, you will get probably 999 different answers. And the Baltic states in Russian imagination have been always different. Even when the Soviet Union was there, the 3 Baltic republics were perceived as something different from the rest of the country. So Russians like those who can afford that, spend vacations there, to travel there, to have property there, even to get citizenship there if possible. But the Baltic countries are gone. It is not a constituent part of the post-Soviet space understood by most Russians and understood by the Kremlin. these three countries are members of the EU and NATO. And if these two institutions are taken seriously anywhere in the world, it's first of all in Moscow. So they are, of course, gone. South Caucasus has become popular also as vacation destination for Russia. And look at Georgia, in spite of all the difficulties in interstate relations, it's a very attractive place to go and spend vacations and spend money and so on and so forth. Central Asia is not yet there, but it may become. I saw many Russian tourists coming to Bukhara and Samarkand. These are the places that also attract Russians. But this is, I'm talking about popular perceptions. From the governmental point of view, of course, Ukraine and Belarus are the most important countries geopolitically, and from the perspective of security, and also they're important economic partners. South Caucasus is a difficult region. Russia would like to play a role as security provider, but it is expensive and difficult. But nowadays we see Russian military presence in all three states of South Caucasus. There is a Russian military base in Armenia. Of course, there is Russian military presence in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which are within internationally recognized borders of Georgia. And now we see the deployment of Russian peacekeepers on the territory of Azerbaijan, namely in Nagorno-Karabakh. When most Russians think of South Caucasus, this is a vacation destination. When policymakers think of South Caucasus, it's all about security, military presence, challenges. Central Asia is a region perceived by the Kremlin probably mostly in security terms. Afghanistan is nearby. And of course, the US troops withdrawal from Afghanistan is a great concern for the Kremlin, in spite of the official propaganda that says actually sooner the Americans are out is better. Not true, because security vacuum may be filled by the forces that Russia is sincerely afraid of. So it's primarily, Central Asia is a region of security challenges and competition with China for influence.
Interestingly, Igor, you have talked mostly about the kinds of national interests, security, economic, travel, and diplomacy that would be fairly universal to any country. I mean, the United States has such interests, Australia has such interests, Finland has such interests. But you yourself have written in your research during your Kennan Fellowship about the issue of kind of citizenship and, you know, Russians abroad. And you have this line in the paper that we've just published today talking about how the Russian kind of mental narrative creates a much larger map of what Russia really is and exceeds Russia's current political boundaries. Now, I think I understand this not to be neo-imperial so much as it is kind of ethno-national. It's reaching out to what it imagines to be kind of Russians or bearers of, носители русской цивилизации or something like that, bearers of Russian civilization. My question then would be, and you and I were chatting about this briefly before we went live, who defines that space? Is it Putin? Is it Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who famously was very precise? He says it's Ukraine, Belarus, and northern Kazakhstan plus Russia. Do you have a definition of that? And some people maybe jokingly, maybe not, have said, well, it should also include, Brighton Beach, right? Or some neighborhoods in Berlin, which are absolutely, I mean, you just hear Russian or, this south part of Tel Aviv, I mean, there are places absolutely which are just completely Russian speaking in the world. How do you grapple with this idea that that Russia's special in having kind of a Ruski Mir that goes far beyond its borders?
Well, a similar question President Putin asked a 9-year boy at the geography competition 4 years ago. And he asked him where Russia's borders ended. And the boy replied, at the Bering Strait. And Putin provided his own answer. He said, Russia's Russian border doesn't end anywhere. So, and after that, there were a lot of billboards in Russia along the roads with this phrase, Russia's borders doesn't end anywhere. Later on, Putin had to clarify that that was a joke. But there is a joke in every joke, but there is also some grain of truth in every joke. There is a saying in Russia that Russians is not a nation, it's a state of mind. So there are different perspectives on what are true or correct or real Russian borders. Mental maps are different. You mentioned Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the founding father of ethnic nationalism in Russia. From my perspective, we can call him as that. And he argued that it was a good thing that the Soviet Union collapsed. The bad thing was that it had collapsed along the wrong borders drawn by the Bolsheviks. And the quote unquote correct borders for him would be borders reflecting ethnic composition of the population. And he argued that the Russian borders would include Belarus, most of Ukraine, northern Kazakhstan, which he called as southern Siberia, northeastern part of Estonia, but most of Chechnya, at least its mountain region, is not a part of true Russia. It should not be a subject of the Russian Federation, but probably an independent state. So this is one vision, ethnic nationalist vision. Zyuganov, of course, had a very different mental.
The head of the Communist Party of modern Russia.
Sorry?
The head of modern Russia's Communist Party, I'm just pointing out.
No, Liberal Democratic Party, Zhirinovsky. I said Zyuganov, I'm sorry.
You said Zyuganov.
Oh, I see, okay. Zyuganov is a leader of the Communist Party of Russian Federation. Well, his mental map reflects his Soviet nostalgia. That is probably the Soviet border, but it doesn't reflect the feelings of most of Russians. Of course, flamboyant leader of Liberal Democratic Party, Mr. Zhirinovsky, had a different map, and at some point it was even a part of the symbol of his party that included Poland and Alaska as parts of Russia. Well, the foundation Ruski Mir, the Russian world, according to its leaders, Russia is where people think in Russian. So very different mental maps, and sometimes they clash. This perception of the world, including political boundaries in the former Soviet Union, reflect the ongoing process of formation of a new nation state in Russia, and this process is not complete yet. And the borders in the territory of the former Soviet Union are changing as we speak. At least there are a lot of de facto changes, if not de jure. And if you look at most of political maps, they do not reflect reality, the post-Soviet space. Political control and formal membership in this or that political body do not coincide in cases of some sub-regions in the post-Soviet space.
Igor, I want to bring in some audience questions. We have some very good ones. And let's turn, if we can, to some of the specific crises and developments that you talk about in your paper. First, Karabakh. Aram Avatisian from Voice of America asked whether the outcome of the recent war and Russia's involvement reflects a strengthening or weakening of Russia's position in the South Caucasus, and what do you see as Russia's main goals with respect to the current Karabakh settlement?
Well, when the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh broke out, the Kremlin found itself in a very difficult position. It put the Kremlin between a rock and a hard place. For Putin, a choice was between two bad options. He would be damned if he had interfered supporting Armenia directly militarily, and damned if he had not, because Russia was obliged to defend Armenia in case of aggression. So it took Putin more than a week to comment on the outbreak of the war, and his words were underwhelming for most Armenians. And he said it is deeply regrettable what is going on right now, and people are being killed, but there is no attack on the territory of Armenia. Russia never recognized Nagorno-Karabakh as part of Armenia or independent entity. By the way, no country in the world, including Armenia, recognized it as that. So Russia always recognized that region as part of Azerbaijan. So from legal perspective and from geopolitical perspective, Putin's position was impeccable. There was no attack on the territory of Armenia proper. So Russia did not have a reason to interfere militarily directly. And of course, the Kremlin didn't want it, and that would not have been supported by the Russian population. At the same time, a powerful Armenian diaspora all over the world, including in Russia, and there are about 2 million ethnic Armenians living in Russia, and by the way, about 2 million ethnic Azerbaijanis living in Russia, that made the situation very difficult for the Kremlin. Just 3 days ago, November 17th, if I'm not mistaken, an interview of President Putin was published. It's one of the most interesting Putin's interviews ever, because it showed a real process of decision-making and dramatic events and direct line between Putin and President Aliyev and Prime Minister Pashinyan, and how difficult it was to reach the agreement. So overall, my personal estimate that the Kremlin played the weak hand well. It played as a peace broker. Finally, the hostility was put to the end, and this is the most important thing. Of course, many people in Armenia view the agreement as something cementing Azerbaijani military gain. This agreement also opened the door if not for direct military presence of Turkey in Azerbaijan, but at least as a power that would be a part of a monitoring group of the agreement. So it's just the beginning of the process. But after some hesitation, Russia is back as a very important player in the region. And we started our conversation with discussion of status and identity. So from this perspective, it's a good outcome for Russia, but it's a very volatile region. We do not know how things will develop. So far, the war has been stopped. For how long, we still do not know. The jury is out.
Igor, I want to get in as many more of the audience questions as I can, but I have to ask you, since I said we'd look at some of the specific issues more closely, do you see so far a parallel between the Russian and Western reactions to the crisis in Belarus and what has happened in Ukraine over the last 6 years? Or is it different?
Russian and Western perception of what is going on in Belarus as
compared to, yeah, so what I'm asking is, Ukraine very clearly went from, I mean, I was there when it began as very much of a domestic political change or crisis, and it turned quickly into geopolitical, in no small part because of Russia's military intervention. Without an explicit military intervention, do you see Belarus developing on the same lines, that it's becoming more geopolitical, or do you think it will remain largely a kind of domestic change in Belarus? And since you mentioned Armenia, that's a good example, right? Where you had basically a kind of revolution in Armenia, which did not become geopolitical.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, of course, the developments in Belarus are somewhat similar, but at the same time, very different from what took place in Ukraine 6 years ago. Yes, indeed, in Belarus, it remains a domestic issue. It's not a geopolitical issue. The most dangerous thing that could happen to European security and probably even Euro-Atlantic security is that the situation when Belarus is a battle between Russia and the West. Of course, this scenario is far-fetched, but you know, this remote danger was so frightening for all parts involved that nobody actually wanted it, and it has not happened. At the same time, the onslaught of the Belarusian opposition is a matter of concern to many people all over the world, including to civil society within Russia. The Kremlin perceived the situation in Belarus, of course, not only in terms of domestic politics in Belarus, but also from geopolitical perspective. As I said earlier, the Kremlin is very much concerned about the Western NATO military presence close to Russian borders, or to that matter to Belarusian borders as well. And this conversion of rotationary deployed US troops in Poland to permanent military presence is a great concern for Russia. And the specter, though, doesn't matter how remote, was that of losing Belarus in terms of a military ally would be a nightmare scenario for Russia. So after a brief period of hesitation, the Kremlin decided to support Mr. Lukashenko. It was very tragic to the Belarusian opposition that view, of course, the Kremlin as an ally of a brutal dictatorship in Belarus now.
But at the same time, we must remember that there is no much love lost between the Kremlin and Mr. Lukashenko. Ideally, the ideal world, the Kremlin would prefer some sort of a managed transition in Belarus to a leader that would be more comfortable partner for the Kremlin. But so far, the bad scenario for Russia would be seeing a leader toppled by the mass protest on the streets of Minsk. And this is something that the Kremlin would look at, being horrified that the same scenario may unfold in Moscow, and the Kremlin thinks that it simply cannot afford that to happen.
We have a couple of questions that I think in a way are related, but if you want to separate them, go ahead. I want to ask them both. So, Jill Doherty is asking whether there's a common element in the conflicts across the former Soviet region. And then George Kroll has just asked whether Russians recognize or accept that people in Belarus and Ukraine, especially the post-Soviet generation, now view themselves as different from Russians and independent. And is there a generational divide on how Russia views itself, on how Russians view this issue versus the Soviet and the post-Soviet generations? And so I guess the way I would suggest addressing that, if you're willing, is kind of generalize it, not just Ukraine and Belarus, but is there such a divide of sort of Soviet identity people and post-Soviet identity people across the region? And is that an important part of what's happening right now?
Absolutely. There is a generational divide in Russia and in all post-Soviet states, and their perceptions are different. Of course, for the younger generation, this Soviet nostalgia is something unknown. I think that what is important here is that the Kremlin doesn't see the citizens of the post-Soviet space, whatever generation they belong to, as independent economic, social, or political actors whose opinions and attitudes matter. The Kremlin feels more comfortable to deal with the post-Soviet leaders, to get together, no matter how difficult partners they are, and reach an agreement. Something the Kremlin does with Mr. Lukashenko. And on a broader scale, from this perspective, say, President Erdogan is very difficult partner, but is a partner you can get together and решить вопрос, and come to some conclusion. And as the Kremlin doesn't see the citizens of its own country as independent economic, social, and political actors, it doesn't see citizens of neighboring countries as such actors. And this is a great limitation for Russia, for the Kremlin's understanding what is going on in the neighboring countries. It looks like many events, at least in Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, and even the outcome of presidential election in Moldova came as a surprise for the Kremlin, because it is not prepared to accept this independent action by the citizens of the neighboring states.
When an election like that happens, and here we have a question from the Kennan Institute's own Morgan Jacobs, when an election happens and the country changes, or revolution happens, and it sort of leans more into a Western center of gravity, and then you get these almost inevitable, right, sort of visits of NATO troops. By the way, those were happening. There were official Ministry of Defense exchanges with NATO happening in Belarus, by the way, already over the last several years. How concerned is Russia by these things? Morgan is asking specifically about the Black Sea region, where Romania, Ukraine, and Georgia are really pushing a kind of NATO presence. And then there's a related question also from Celestine Boland, who's asking, when these elections happen and you see a change to kind of more pro-Western leadership like Moldova recently, or even Armenia a couple of years ago, does the Kremlin change its tone in response? Does the Kremlin become kind of more pragmatic or more arm's length in its relations, or does it still expect the same, as you say, you know, kind of discussion to решить вопросы, right? Like kind of very traditional style of doing business with these very new leaders, very different leaders.
Well,
maybe it's two questions.
Sure. First of all, the Black Sea region and the Baltic Sea region are the regions we should follow and look at very closely. And there are very troublesome events actually are going on. I'm talking about the incidents in the sea, in the air, over the Black Sea, over the Baltic Sea, these encounters between the air forces and the Navy of NATO on the one hand and Russia on the other hand. And of course, when the Kremlin looks at the post-Soviet space, it views it as a battle, as I said earlier, between Russia and the Western countries for power and influence. But these are not abstract categories when the Russian military planners see the military infrastructure of NATO coming closer to the Russian borders. And that is why any election or any unrest in the neighboring countries in Russia are viewed not as only political developments, domestic political developments in these countries, but as potentially geopolitical developments. And that's why Russian policy towards Belarus was actually aimed at preventing domestic political developments turning into geopolitical development. And so far, the Kremlin has been successful in that. But of course, the West also showed a lot of restraint, understanding that Belarus is something the Kremlin was ready to fight for if there was a prospect of Belarus becoming, well, not pro-Russian. A very interesting part of the question about the Kremlin policies becoming more pragmatic or not. There is enough evidence to believe that it's becoming more pragmatic. Its behavior towards the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh, its attitude towards Moldova so far have been more pragmatic than ideologically driven. From my perspective, this short period of time from 2013 approximately to 2016, when ideology played a very important role in the Kremlin policies, where with all the talk about civilization, historic identity, this unchanging and unchangeable Russia making its own independent journey through history from the times of Grand Prince Vladimir to Vladimir Putin and so on. This period is over. Russia has tried to tone down its rhetoric about the Russian world, receiving very strong messages from President Lukashenko, President Nazarbayev at that time, that they didn't like this rhetoric at all. and it is absent from the official vocabulary. It's a domain of Russian nationalists mostly, and activities of cultural establishment institutions like the Russian World Fund, for example. So we see some signs of the Kremlin policies in the post-Soviet states space becoming more pragmatic, but we will see what happens next.
Let me, Igor, I think we have really the perfect question to end on from Chris Bort, who's a former national intelligence officer for Russia, and I know follows these issues very closely. It's a great question. You know, contemplate and give us, if you will, your kind of you know, top list, if any, lessons that have been learned in the Kremlin by the crises that we have talked about in Belarus and Karabakh. We haven't talked quite as much about Kyrgyzstan, but more generally, crises in the post-Soviet space. What lessons is the Kremlin taking away from these in the contemporary time frame? And thank you, Chris, for that great question.
First of all, I think that Moscow understands that it has very limited ability to influence domestic political developments, even in those countries that are mostly dependent on Russia economically and in the area of security, like Belarus and Kyrgyzstan and Armenia. The Kremlin does not control and has very little influence on domestic political scene. This is the first lesson I believe that they have drawn. The second is that the Kremlin must rethink its instrument of influence. If there is serious analysis, and I'm not privy to what is going on right now in the Kremlin, of course, but if there is a sober, serious analysis of what is going on, the Kremlin must rethink its instruments of power in the post-Soviet space. And if it is good analysis, I believe that the Kremlin must come to the conclusion that it must learn how to deal not only with strong leaders, but also with political opposition, with civil society, with diasporas, with all those non-traditional actors in international relations. When we say international relations, we usually mean interstate relations, but actually true international relations, especially in the modern world, when there are numerous new independent actors, like those I already mentioned, like opposition, civil society, but also big cities as independent actors, as corporations and interests of businesses, and so on and so forth. And Moscow is not very good at all that. So I hope that this is another lesson that Moscow would learn. And finally, this is an unpredictable place, the post-Soviet space. And both Moscow and the West will face many surprises in the very near as well as in distant future. And both Moscow and the Western countries must learn how to deal with them. And the most important thing, how to not allow those disturbances in this part of the world to lead to a major confrontation between Russia and the West.
I think those are really great takeaways, Igor, not only for the Russian side, but I would argue for the West and for everybody else. And your final point about unpredictability is exactly why we will continue to follow this entire region as closely as we do, we will certainly continue to feature your views, and we're very grateful to you for sharing them and spending so much time with us. As I'm grateful to all of you who submitted questions. I apologize to those that I might not have gotten to in our limited time. I want to thank you once again for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.